All right, let's dive into some philosophy today. We've got this book, Descubrir la Filosofía, by Manuel Cruz, and it explains like the thoughts of all these major philosophers in a way that's never been done before. So I'm always a little, I don't know, how do you make philosophy simple? But I'm open to seeing if they can actually pull it off. What do you think?
It definitely tries to,
Yeah.
balance that sort of academic side with, making it understandable for somebody who's
Right.
maybe just, starting to learn about philosophy. Like, it uses a lot of examples.
Yeah.
And even, like, little fun facts, which I like.
Yeah.
But, does it actually, like, change how we understand these thinkers? I don't know.
Yeah, because sometimes those fun facts are kind of gimmicky. You know what I mean? But speaking of interesting people, the author himself, Manuel Cruz, he's done a lot, it seems like.
Oh, yeah. He's a professor at the University of Barcelona. He's written, like, 20 books, I think. And
Yeah.
he's won a bunch
He's
everywhere.
very-
So
yeah.
he definitely, like, knows his stuff.
Yeah, that makes me more inclined to give it a shot. So before we get into the details, what's the kind of overall approach of the book? Like, how does it try to make philosophy easier to understand?
There's this quote from Michel Onfray, and I think it sums up the book pretty well. He says, "Philosophy is not a juggling act tending towards art for art's sake and consecrated to the cult of ideal fetishes. Nor is it a closed discipline destined for a minority. It does not need to create neologisms or cultivate obscurity." Basically, Cruz is trying to show that philosophy isn't, just for, like, elites. It's for everyone,
I like that. Philosophy for the people, right? But how does the book actually do that? Like, how does it explain all these complicated ideas?
Well, one of the first things you see is this really cool timeline. It shows you all these philosophers organized by, what time period they were from, starting with the pre-Socratics all the way up to, like, postmodernism.
A timeline. I like visuals, but is it really, like, helpful, or is it just a fancy list of names?
I think it's actually pretty helpful, especially if you're, just starting out with philosophy, because it helps you see how philosophy changed over time and how, like, different philosophers and movements connect to, like, historical events. For example, you can see how, like, the rise of existentialism in the 20th century was influenced by, World War II.
Oh, that's a good point. Like, seeing those connections can really bring history to life. Okay, so we've got the big picture, but what about, like, the main attraction? Which philosophers does the book actually focus on?
It's a lot of the, what you might call the greatest hits of philosophy, like Plato, Kant, Nietzsche, Wittgenstein, Aristotle, Descartes.
Right, like the Hall of Fame. It makes sense to focus on, like, the big names. But do you think it misses anyone? Like, are there any philosophers who maybe aren't as famous but should be included?
Well, before we get into that, there was one thing I thought was interesting. The book calls Nietzsche the enfant terrible of philosophy. So it made me think, like, why was he seen as so, like, radical, and what impact did he actually have?
Yeah, that's a good question, because just calling him the enfant terrible doesn't really explain why his ideas were so groundbreaking. What was it about him that, like, challenged the status quo?
Well, for one thing, Nietzsche, he questioned, like, all the traditional ideas about morality and religion. He said that those systems were based on what he called a slave morality that, like, stopped people from being free and creative. Instead, he wanted people to embrace power and individuality, like the will to power.
So he was basically saying, like, forget the rules and just be your true self.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. But yeah, you're getting the idea. Nietzsche's ideas were so radical because he was basically challenging, like, the foundation of Western thought,
It's crazy how a philosopher from, like, over a century ago can still be so relevant today.
Yeah.
Speaking of thought-provoking philosophers, the book mentions Kant, and it says that his ideas were like a Copernican revolution in thought. That's a pretty big claim. Well,
Yeah.
What do they mean by that?
Well, Kant was definitely a revolutionary thinker. But to understand why, we have to, like, look back at what he was responding to. Before Kant, philosophers generally believed that our knowledge came directly from, like, the world around us. We observe things, and that's how we learn. But Kant, he kind of flipped that idea. He said that our minds aren't just, like, passive receivers of information. They actually shape how we experience reality.
Oh, so instead of the world telling us what we know, it's our minds that create our reality.
Yeah, exactly. And that idea had a huge impact on, like, how we think about everything from, like, science and morality to art and religion.
Wow, that's pretty mind-blowing. No wonder they called it a revolution. Okay, so we've got Nietzsche, the rule breaker, and Kant, the mind bender. Who else does the book talk about?
Well, there's Schopenhauer. His work is still really popular today because he talked a lot about how human existence is driven by, like, irrational and destructive forces.
That's a little dark. But I guess it's important to, understand the not-so-great parts of human nature, too. So it seems like this book is a good introduction to some of the big names in philosophy. But does it stick to the, traditional philosophers? Or does it branch out a bit?
It actually includes some people you might not expect, like Sigmund Freud and Karl Marx.
Oh, that's interesting. But what do they have to do with philosophy? How does the book connect them to the philosophical world?
That's a good question. Freud is obviously more known for, psychology.
Yeah.
And Marx is associated with, economics and politics. But the book argues that their ideas actually have, broader philosophical implications. Like, for example, Freud's work on the unconscious. It challenged how we think about, rationality and self-knowledge, right? And Marx's critique of capitalism raised some really important questions about social justice and freedom.
Okay, I see. So it's about looking at philosophy in a more interdisciplinary way, right? Like recognizing that philosophical ideas can come from all sorts of places. I like that. So it's not just about individual thinkers, but also, the bigger conversations that have been happening throughout history. Does the book talk about any of those?
Oh, definitely. It goes into, medieval philosophy, Hellenistic philosophy, and even postmodernism.
Postmodernism, that's a concept that gets thrown around a lot, but I feel like it's rarely explained well. How does the book tackle it?
Well, it seems like they're focusing on how it critiques, traditional ways of knowing things and, power structures. And they also talk about how language and culture shape our reality.
So it's like saying there's no one right answer.
Pretty much, yeah.
Interesting. Hold on. I just noticed something in the back of the book. There's this list. It's numbered, and it's titled Todos los protagonistas, which I think means all the protagonists. What's that all about?
Oh, yeah. It looks like this book is just the beginning. Each volume in the series goes into more detail about one of these 40 philosophers.
A numbered list leading to more books. I wonder if that's really helpful. Or just a marketing gimmick. But I guess we'll see where this philosophical journey takes us. It definitely has me curious to learn more.
Yeah, 40 philosophers, that's a lot. And it's not just the usual suspects either. There are some less well-known names in there, too.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Who? I'm all for, branching out. But I'm curious how they justify including those names in a philosophy book.
Well, we already mentioned Freud and Marx.
Yeah.
But there's also Søren Kierkegaard, who's considered the father of existentialism. Yeah. And Jose Ortega y Gasset, a Spanish philosopher who focused a lot on identity and cultural crisis.
Kierkegaard and Ortega y Gasset, those are some great additions. But I have to say, I'm a bit skeptical about this whole deep dive thing. Can you really do justice to a philosopher's entire body of work in just one volume?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's definitely hard to condense all of someone's ideas into a single book without oversimplifying things.
Yeah.
But I think the goal here is more to give you an introduction, a starting point.
Right. So it's more like a taste of their philosophy, not the whole meal.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense. But even with a good introduction, I'm still not sure about that whole explaining these thinkers like never before thing. Is there really anything new here? Or is it just, the same old ideas repackaged?
It's hard to say for sure without, reading each book in this series. But I think what this book does well is it connects these philosophical ideas too, current events and modern problems. It shows how these ideas are still relevant today.
So it's like bridging the gap between the past and the present.
Exactly.
I like that. It's not just about history. It's about how these ideas can help us understand the world we live in now.
Right.
Okay, so we talked about connecting to the present. But the book also mentioned coupling different philosophical movements. The timeline showed all those major eras from ancient Greece to, today. Were there any periods that you thought were especially important?
Well, the timeline does a good job of showing you the whole scope of, philosophical history. But there were a few periods that the book kind of emphasized, medieval philosophy, for example. It's often overlooked, I think. People tend to focus more on the ancient Greeks or the Enlightenment, but medieval philosophy was really crucial.
Yeah, I've always been interested in that period, but I don't know much about it. What made it so important?
Well, it was a time when people were really wrestling with some big questions, like the relationship between faith and reason and the nature of God. Thinkers like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas were really influential during that time.
So they were basically laying the groundwork for all the debates we're still having today about religion and, the limits of human reason. Wow, that's fascinating. It's amazing how these conversations from centuries ago are still so relevant, but, Does the book acknowledge any of the criticisms of traditional Western philosophy, like its focus on, white European males?
Yeah, it does. It definitely acknowledges those critiques. And it tries to be more inclusive. Like, it talks about women philosophers.
Yeah.
And thinkers from non-Western traditions.
That's good to hear. Because for a long time, philosophy was pretty much a boys' club, right? So it's good that the book is trying to broaden the conversation.
Yeah, it definitely makes the subject feel more relevant to, the world we live in today.
Absolutely. Speaking of relevant, we talked about postmodernism earlier. How does the book handle that? Does it actually make it understandable?
Well, I wouldn't say it makes it easy, because postmodernism is just, a really complex concept. But the book does a good job of explaining the main ideas.
Yeah.
And the key thinkers, like Derrida and Foucault.
Right. Like, those are some big names. Yeah. I think it's important to, engage with those challenging ideas, even if they're hard to understand.
Oh, definitely. Philosophy isn't about finding easy answers.
Yeah.
It's about, wrestling with those difficult questions.
Well said. I think this book, even with its flaws, does a good job of encouraging that kind of thinking.
Yeah, it gives you a taste of all these different philosophical ideas. And then it's up to you to, explore the ones that really interest you.
Exactly.
And who knows, maybe this deep dive will inspire some of our listeners to start their own philosophical journey.
And that's what I think is so cool about philosophy. It's not about, memorizing facts and figures. It's about asking those big questions, the questions that really make you think.
Yeah, and realizing that those questions might not have, any easy answers, or maybe any answers at all. But it's the process of, thinking about them. That's what's important.
So it's more about the journey than the destination.
Right.
I like that.
And what I find really interesting is how all these philosophers, even though they lived in, totally different times and places, they were all asking the same basic questions about, what it means to be human.
Yeah, those big questions about meaning and reality and the limits of what we can know, they've been around forever.
And in a world where, we're constantly bombarded with information and everyone's got an opinion, I think philosophy is more important than ever.
Yeah, it forces us to, slow down and actually think for ourselves.
Right. It's about questioning your assumptions.
Really questioning them, not just accepting what everyone else tells you.
Exactly.
So, as we wrap up our deep dive into Descubrir la Filosofía, what really stood out to you? What got you thinking?
I think for me, it was how the book showed how all these philosophical ideas are connected. It's not just a bunch of random theories. It's a conversation that's been going on for centuries.
Yeah, and we can all be a part of that conversation.
Exactly.
And that's what makes philosophy so exciting, I think. It's for everyone.
Right. You don't need a PhD to appreciate these ideas.
You just need to be curious.
And maybe a little bit patient, because some of this stuff can be pretty dense.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
But it's worth the effort.
Definitely. So if you're feeling inspired, go pick up a philosophy book or join a discussion group or just have a good conversation with a friend.
There's a whole world of ideas out there.
So keep exploring and happy philosophizing.